Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Michael Kugelman. Michael is Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Asia program, where he also serves as the Senior Associate for South Asia. Nandan Unnikrishnan is a Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He joined ORF in 2004 and he leads the Eurasia program. Alexey Davydov is a research fellow at the Regional Relations Study Group, and Alexey Kurpriyanov is head of the group on South Asia and the Indian Ocean of the Center for Asia-Pacific Studies, both Alexeys with the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. They join us today to discuss a trilateral perspective on the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. And before we dig into the subject matter, Michael, if I could ask you to set this up for us. The Wilson Center has been involved in these trilateral discussions for a number of years now. Could you tell us about that project?
Yeah, well, it's been several years that we've been having these frequent conversations among ourselves, the Wilson Center, as well as our partners, IMEMO and ORF in Russia and India, respectively. And I have to give credit to the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and particularly Matthew Rajansky, who had been instrumental in initiating this thing. And we're very proud of it, particularly because so far as we know, it's one of a kind. We don't know of any other US, India, Russia trilateral happening at this moment. We've had a series of private exchanges for several years, and we came out with a public product, a book, a report looking at potential pathways for cooperation between the US, India, and Russia in Afghanistan. It was published earlier this year. Clearly, a lot of things have changed since then, but we think it still offered some inputs and some reflections that captured some of the discussions that we had within the trilateral on Afghanistan in the months preceding the publication of the report.
And that report is available online, is that correct?
Absolutely. All three of our organizational websites have posted it.
Excellent. Okay, and we'll, for those of you watching, we will provide links to the report either on the bottom of your screen or in the data that you'll see on the accompanying page. So you'll be able to find that report. Thank you, Michael. If what we could do is begin with sort of a discussion from each of the three countries' perspectives of defining what national interests are in Afghanistan for each. Nandan, can we begin with you? What are the national interests for India as it relates to Afghanistan?
Thank you, John. For India, India has had a long relationship with Afghanistan. But today, given the fact that we've seen a regime change, if you want, in Afghanistan since August, India's primary concern, is the humanitarian aspect. The Afghan people, they have suffered for the past 40 years. They've been through war. And we do not want to see them losing out on the gains they had in the past 20 years, but not just the political gains, but also the economic gains. So there is that concern. From a directly Indian perspective, of course, our concern is primarily security. It is that we do not want the growth of radical elements within Afghanistan and radical elements who are looking for external action, because the Taliban will not, hopefully, not give them space at all, but maybe the Taliban will restrict their actions internally, but will not be able to do anything much if they decide to move out. And for us, we've had that experience when Taliban 1.0 was in power. We've had that experience with incursions by people who trained in Afghanistan and came into Kashmir. We've dealt with it. I think India is capable of dealing with the threat that exists as it exists today, but it is of a major concern.
Thank you. Alexey, let's begin with Alexey Davydov, and we'll hear from both Alexeys on this from the Russian perspective as it relates to national interests.
From my point of view, Russia also shares the same interest of security stabilization in not only in Afghanistan, but also in the region. The main interest, I believe, is long-term stabilization in Afghanistan in local perspective, because as we see that the gray zone that has developed in recent years brings further challenges towards the Central Asian securities and the states, and those states are members of a collective security treaty organization. It's like US or Western NATO towards Russia in comparison to Russia and these states. And therefore, since our Central Asian states are interconnected with each other and with Russia, it is primarily great interest to save to prevent the export of radicalization and terrorist activities in this region. And secondly, I think that the main interest of Russia is preventing Afghanistan becoming a battleground of great power competition between great regional states. From my perspective, this will undermine the first interest, since those parties that are involved in internal process of this country will try to export the negative prospects towards each other. And I think that both three parties involved in this dialogue are interested in preventing it.
Thanks. Alexey Kurpriyanov.
Oh, well, I absolutely agree with first Alexei, but well, I think that Moscow has two interests in Afghanistan. First is tranquility and security, stability on the southern borders of the post-Soviet space, and second, the ability of implement infrastructure projects that would link the post-Soviet space with South Asia. Russia really is quite satisfied with the situation in which, well, detachment of armed militias do not cross the border with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. You do not call all Muslims of the region to jihad. Moscow is quite indifferent to who exactly provides this security. Well, the emergence of a stable regime in Kabul is a necessary step towards the implementation of the second Moscow's aim, but there are great doubts that this regime will be truly stable. In terms of its infrastructure, Afghanistan is a black hole with zero transport connectivity. And in order to change this, it is necessary to invest a huge amounts of money there. I don't think Russia is ready for this.
Thanks. Michael, I don't know that we'll hear a lot different in terms of U.S. concerns as it relates to humanitarian and security. But geography is certainly a factor in all of this as well. And our other two countries in the trilateral discussion certainly have more of a geographic imperative to hope for stability.
Yeah, this is absolutely right. Issues of stability are not as significant in U.S. strategic calculations of Afghanistan as they are for Russia and India, because clearly, the U.S. has the luxury of leaving Afghanistan, which it did, and doesn't need to worry about the regional spillover effects of destabilization and so on. But for the U.S., counterterrorism or countering terrorism is the key interest, and here it's very much in line with India and Russian concerns as well. The Biden administration's main goal, beyond trying to deliver humanitarian supplies and get out any remaining Americans in Afghanistan in the coming weeks, the U.S.'s main goal is to figure out how to ensure a capacity to carry out counterterrorism activities, mainly surveillance, but also potentially airstrikes against terrorist targets. The challenge, of course, will be doing this without boots on the ground. It's going to need, at least for now, to depend on existing U.S. military facilities in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf. And obviously, it's a lot harder to do that when you don't have boots on the ground.
I want to follow up on this notion of boots on the ground, right? Russia, of course, historically has had boots on the ground in Afghanistan, the U.S. for the last 20 years. Is it possible to gain the type of stability and contain the spread of radicalization that all of you have spoken about, either directly or indirectly, without so-called boots on the ground? Are intelligence capabilities, is technology at a place where that is possible? And I know we began formally by me asking each of you a first question so that we could establish you for the viewers. But at this point, anyone who has anything to say, please feel free to jump into the discussion.
I could take a quick brief stab. It's going to be very difficult to do what you suggest, John, and U.S. officials are well aware of that. And it's gotten to the point that not only does the U.S. not have boots on the ground, it doesn't have eyes on the ground. I mean, at least formally, the U.S. military presence is gone, and this has raised some rather tricky, unsettling questions for U.S. officials as to whether they need to think about partnering with the Taliban. At the least to counter the threat posed by ISIS Khorasan, which is a threat for both the US and the Taliban. But certainly it's going to be very difficult to do that. And I think that in the context of our trilateral, certainly the three sides all agree that ISIS Khorasan is a threat to all three countries. But the question is, how do we get to a point where we could talk about actually cooperating to pursue that goal? It would be very difficult. I think but what we could hope for is to have mechanisms for dialogue where there could be continuous discussions about the threat and how to focus on countering it. But the operational aspects of that, very difficult to do for the United States alone, much less in broader multilateral contexts.
In terms of, I'm sorry, go ahead, Nandan.
I would tend to agree broadly with Michael. But the point is that I think there is a possibility of cooperation. And yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, in the Senate, when your military officials were briefing the senators, they did mention that they're in talks with Russia and other Central Asian countries about using bases in Central Asia for remote strikes, even if there are no boots on the ground. So I think the technology exists. The problem the United States faces is what you had mentioned, John, the fact that you're geographically distant.
Is there any disagreement among Russia, the US, and India on defining the nature of the threat? Or is there general agreement on what the problems are, what the nature of the problems are?
If I may.
If I may, just for a second, I'm sorry to pop it like this. There is disagreement. India is in a firm position that we don't distinguish between the good terrorists and the bad terrorists. So the question of cooperation with Taliban does not arise. Yes, we may engage in terms of, ensuring that humanitarian aid reaches, that there is elevation of the suffering of the Afghan people, but I don't think recognition of the Taliban is on the table. Whereas, at least in the run-up to this, till the Taliban came to power, both the United States and Russia were in effect legitimizing the Taliban, the US through the Doha talks, the Russia through a variety of other formats. So now the question is, how do you work around this?
I'm sorry, someone else was about to say something as well. It was Alexey, I think that was you.
Yeah, if I may, regarding the possibilities of trilateral cooperation, I believe that all three states, or maybe if we include other states, really, if we join in a kind of a forum like we had, for example, regarding the Iran nuclear problem, regarding the JCPOA agreement, there might be a possibility of creating a framework for Taliban regime to educate this regime, how to behave in the international arena. Of course, we have different visions regarding how we should or should not cooperate or deal with it. But nevertheless, from my perspective, creating a system of behavior, coordination of our behavior is a necessary thing to cope with the security challenge.
Alexey K.
Okay. I'd like just to add a couple of words about that. I think now we're faced with a new reality because what we are seeing now is a short episode, is a long history of development of Afghan society, because part of this society is in modernity, part in archaic, and there are still a lot of lines that divide the body of this society in different directions. So I believe that we will soon see a resumption of hostilities, albeit not as active as we saw. It will be a long, sluggish war that will flare up brightly as soon as some outside force decides that it is necessary necessary to intervene in the situation. And we must proceed from this. And in the case of this war, surprises such as invasions of warlords from northern Afghanistan into neighboring countries are possible. But I don't think the Taliban will launch a full-scale war in Central Asia. They already have something to do. And in the course of these incursions, well, surprises. In fact, I doubt that we will need United States help to repel these small incursions.
You know, we're looking at this situation through this trilateral lens. And each of you have discussed potential for cooperation. I wonder if we can look back, and is there precedent among India, Russia, and the United States in cooperation in this region of the world?
That's a good question, and it's hard to gauge just because things in Afghanistan have changed so frequently over the years. You know, the interesting thing, if you look at the last few months, really the last year or so, there's been a striking amount of cooperation between the U.S. and Russia and Pakistan in the context of the reconciliation process that briefly played out in Afghanistan. You had a grouping, you have a grouping called the Troika, which involves the U.S., China, Russia, and Pakistan, where there have been several meetings. And the four countries have continued to be mentioned in the same context in recent weeks in terms of shared concerns about the Taliban needing to be more inclusive. But the challenge, and Nandan may want to get into this more, is that India has increasingly faced a major strategic disadvantage just because of Pakistan's support and closeness to the Taliban, which has been longstanding. And it has really put India in a position now where it's very difficult for India to be involved in regional diplomatic efforts just because Pakistan is playing so much of a role. But India has played, historically, over the last 20 years, has played a significant role in Afghanistan just because of its development assistance. It was a very important bilateral partner to all of the non-Taliban governments. But in terms of US, India, Russia coming together over the last 20 years, there's not all that much indications of formal cooperation, though I leave it to my colleagues to offer additional inputs.
Alexey Davydov?
If I'm not mistaken, all three parties helped the Northern Alliance during the fight with Taliban in the 90s and during the US intervention in this country. And throughout our trilateral dialogues that we had between our three think tanks, we all, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that we tend to agree that we could have a dialogue regarding creating a mechanism of providing humanitarian aid towards Afghan people, and that would not be redistributed or controlled by the Taliban government.
Nandan, I know you want to say something, but I also want to ask you a quick question as a follow-up to Michael's comments about Pakistan and India. From India's perspective, based on its relations with Pakistan, does it see Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban as a potential point of leverage or as part of the problem?
I'll come to that, but first, Alexey sort of preempted me. But it's true. I mean, one is that we had the Northern Alliance, but even in the first years, you know, when the first Bonn conference and all took place, when the Taliban was just displaced, all three of us were more or less on the same page. And we did cooperate a lot when the special envoys talked to each other and all. The divergences started subsequently. The divergence really started soon after Mr. Obama announced the withdrawal. And that is when Russia realized that the Americans are going to leave. So they started a more active policy of establishing independent links to the Taliban. The Russians have always had links. I mean, they have very strong links in Afghanistan, but they activated them. As far as cooperation today is concerned, the problem is the country with the maximum leverage for a variety of historical reasons is Pakistan. Pakistan and India are not on the best of terms, to put it mildly. And part of the reason that India is not in any of these various conversations, whether it's in the Doha group or troika or whatever, is that there is a very strong objection from Pakistan itself and the other countries, and maybe rightly so, Russia and US and China do accept those objections, because for them it's vastly more important to bring Taliban and Pakistan to the table than to get into a fight with Pakistan about whether India's presence there is legitimate or not. So I think, pragmatism dictates some compromises, and that it takes place and that India suffers, yes. So right now, India is sitting on the sidelines in what our foreign minister described as wait and watch mode. How long that will continue is difficult to say, but India has very little leverage on the ground in Pakistan, and the best it can hope is using its international contacts to try and somehow have its concerns placed in the discussions on Afghanistan.
In the context of this notion of wait and watch, I'm wondering if each of you could share with us your perspective on what are reasonable expectations for the Taliban as you wait and watch. As you look around the globe beyond the 3 countries that we're representing today, there's a lot of waiting and watching and finding out if the Taliban moves in the direction of becoming a legitimate government and a member of the international community, or remains something else. And I wonder if you could help us calibrate our expectations. What do you believe is realistic in this regard? Alexey K., let's begin with you.
Okay. So from my point of view, I think that, so in my opinion, there are 2 sets of wishes in Russia. One are possible, another impossible. Well, the impossible and most realistic implies that Taliban will simply sit quietly, interact on security issues, and allow infrastructure projects to be carried out for little money. And impossible that the Taliban will turn the country into a prosperous paradise, return civil liberties with a national flavor to Afghans, and to pursue a policy friendly to Russia, India, and so on. I would be glad to be wrong, but the second option seems to me rather unlikely so far. And I think that Taliban will try to stabilize its new government, its new leadership in Afghanistan, and will try to suppress any guerrilla groups and guerrilla fighters. And then Taliban will seek for any international help. Will it be in money, in international recognition, and so on, so on, so on. I think that Taliban will try to become legitimate, to be recognized as legitimate leadership, legitimate government of Afghanistan.
Alexey D, I'm avoiding saying Alexey 1 and Alexey 2 because I don't want to do any rankings of the Alexeys. So I'm going with the first initial of your last name.
Yeah, I think that this question is a very interesting one and very important one. It's difficult to predict what will be happening within half a year or even a number of months ahead, because today Taliban is presenting himself as a totally different actor. He used to be, this organization used to be an anti-governmental force, and now it should present itself as a governmental force. And whether it will be successful or not, it depends not only on its policies, but also on the actions of other members of the international community. From my perspective, if countries in the region coin a specific framework towards this regime, the situation might be stabilized, but who knows what will come next.
Michael.
Yeah, I think the U.S. Has both short-term and longer-term expectations of the Taliban, and the short-term ones are more realistic. The short-term ones are very simple. Essentially, there's an expectation that the Taliban will help the U.S. get out any remaining Americans in Afghanistan that want to get out. And beyond that, the U.S. expects that the Taliban will not pose obstacles to the delivery of humanitarian supplies. Beyond that, it gets more complicated. The U.S. is expecting the Taliban to or wants to think that the Taliban will crack down on our help crackdown on terrorist groups, particularly ISIS, Khorasan, and Al-Qaeda. And the US is also looking for the Taliban to bring in more inclusivity into its government and to show more respect for human rights and women's rights. Now, certainly people here in Washington don't have any illusions. That's going to be those are very difficult asks of the Taliban. But I do think that US recognition, formal recognition of the Taliban government would be conditioned on seeing progress in those areas, which are unlikely. So I think, quite frankly, it's unlikely that you're going to see the US government recognize the Taliban government anytime soon, if at all.
So just to be clear, what those last things you just defined, more inclusive government, rights of women, these are more hopes than they are expectations. Is that correct?
That's probably a better way to put it, yes.
Yeah. Nandan.
Well, I mean, all three of my colleagues have mentioned all the relevant points. But the only thing that I would like to add is one has to keep in mind that the Taliban is not a monolith. I mean, even in the formation of the government, we saw that different factions differed. There were, in fact, reports of a major fight while the government formation was being made, to the extent that the spokesman of the Taliban had to put out a video of Mullah Baradar to prove that the man was alive and not harmed and all. So clearly, the process of agreement within the Taliban to come to a common agenda, common platform, is going to still take some time. And I agree with Alexey Kurpriyanov and Michael that that process of compromise within the various factions of the Taliban is not something that enthuses me about the future of Afghanistan, because that will probably mean that the compromises will be made on human rights, on gender rights, and we are going to see rather strict adherence to the Sharia law, which again goes back to the last point made by Michael. It would mean that it would delay international recognition to the Taliban. But what the international community will have to work around is how does it engage with the Taliban to ensure delivery of humanitarian aid while keeping the pressure on the Taliban to make it understand that unless there is greater inclusiveness, unless there is greater respect for the rights of women, that it will be very difficult for the Taliban to occupy a place, let's say, in the United Nations.
Nandan makes a really critical point, gentlemen, about the lack of a monolith, right? That we can't think of the Taliban monolithically. And in the early days of its reign from Kabul, we saw literal disputes that turned into physical disputes. We saw scuffle among leadership. So when we think about stability, how stable is the Taliban itself? Is this something that could unravel the equivalent of a civil war within the Taliban, or would that be overstating the nature of the rift?
Well, what we've seen over time with the Taliban is that when there have been cases of dissenters within the ranks, the top Taliban leadership has tended to act very quickly and oftentimes brutally to deal with those dissenters to the point that it doesn't spin out of control. But I think that at this point, the Taliban is in uncharted territory. It's going to be under a lot of stress and pressure, trying to consolidate power, trying to deal with the really serious economic and humanitarian crisis, dealing with the terrorist threat from ISIS Khorasan, which has been carrying out attacks on Taliban individuals nearly on an everyday basis in recent weeks. That suggests that you could, to the extent that you have fissures or differences within the ranks, the stress and the pressure that the Taliban is under now could exacerbate those tensions and fissures. So it could be more difficult for the top Taliban leadership to nip those differences in the bud, so to speak.
Any other thoughts on that internal rifts?
I would tend to agree with that. Okay. I would also, I would also believe that as long as there is no external threat, I mean, for example, the threat that existed in the Panjshir Valley in Taliban 1.0, when Ahmed Shah Massoud led an opposition, as long as no threat like that emerges, the Taliban, the disparities, the vociferous tendencies within the Taliban will play a role. But if a threat like that emerges, they will unite.
Gentlemen, moderators, people like me, journalists, we have this compulsion to often try to take a discussion like this and find some sort of concluding question that wraps it in a tidy package. And obviously, this is a complex and unfolding situation, and that's not possible. That's not available to me. So here's what I thought I'd do instead as we close out our discussion. Each of you representing think tanks that provide deep analysis and deep study. And one of the things you look at beyond headlines that news organizations look at are trend lines, things that we should be keeping our eyes on over the long term that could have even a more dramatic impact on history than today's headlines. So I want to ask each of you before we close to help us identify those things that you'll be watching. What are the areas that you're going to be keeping an eye on that you think could, over the course of time, be most defining? Let's begin in the order of introduction, or the reverse order of introduction, and that means Alexey Kurpriyanov, you go first.
Okay, so for me, it will be economy, because we got a country with a drug economy as a central of Asia. And if earlier the existence of this drug economy was perceived as a natural during the war, now the question arises what to do with it. So we will have, in fact, a flow of drugs into Europe, into South Asia, into Middle East. And there, so what the international community should do with this? Should it something to suppress of this economy, to use any leverage to stop it, because it's natural from the point of view of Middle Ages, well, of medieval view, maybe point of view, but not from the modern point of view, because to have a country with a drug economy is essential of modern world, it's quite nonsense.
You know, you start with the economy. There's an old adage about that it exists in the U.S. since the days of Watergate, follow the money, and it seems to still have application all these years later. Alexey Davydov.
Yeah, I will be watching for the search for internal consensus building, because for the last 40 or even maybe more years, the Afghan society didn't manage to bring into a consensus with each other. There was different external interventions, different regime changes, and hopefully within further years, maybe 10, maybe 20 years, we will see an Afghanistan that is stable, pacified, and in consensus with itself.
Thank you. Nandan Unnikrishnan.
Well, I completely agree with the previous two. I will, in addition to that, look very carefully at the Taliban's relationship with Pakistan. Not because I am sitting in India, but because if they show a certain level of independence, if they show that they are willing to move beyond what they were in Taliban 1.0, then I think the international community may find it easier to engage with them. But if they continue to be in the mold where they are merely providing strategic depth, as it were, then it is going to be more difficult because the mentality of governance, which means delivering, as Alexey said, economic goods beyond the drug economy, is not something that will permeate their consciousness.
Thanks. Michael.
Yeah, at this point, all the key trend lines have been identified. The only one I would add is personnel. What types of individuals does the Taliban try to bring into the government beyond those that are leading the ministries? And we know these are all hardliners and in many cases, outright terrorists. You know, the Taliban needs all the help it can get with dealing with these really serious policy challenges, economic crisis, humanitarian crisis. The Taliban doesn't have the experience and the ability on its own to deal with these challenges. So will it be willing to bring in some economists and technocrats who are not Taliban? It's going to be tough. I think many of the very people that it would need with the skill sets it needs have left the country. Many others would be afraid and wouldn't want to work with the Taliban. But I think that's the thing to watch. And I think the there are a lot of consequences drawing from that could have implications for the Taliban's ability to consolidate and hold power and prevent the emergence of a new armed resistance. So yeah, I'm going to be watching to see what type of people the Taliban tries to get to fill those mid-level posts in the government.
Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for helping us sort through the complexity and nuances of this situation. Your ongoing work is greatly appreciated. And congratulations on the Trilateral collaboration. Just want to tell our viewers that we will, as I said, provide you with links to all of the organizations, and you can find much more content from all of our guests by visiting their websites. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.